Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. So this is the second installment of the CAHRS Fall Partner Meeting. And the broader topic today that we're going to talk about is on the focus area of employee mental health and well-being. And so I'm really excited. So I'm Chris Collins. I'm a faculty member here at Cornell and former director of CAHRS. And I'm going to have a really nice slate today. So the first thing we're going to do is we've got our two CAHRS Research Assistants, so Tiffany Jordan and Nate Miletovich, who are going to talk about the research that they've been doing on the health and wellness area, particularly in the part of employee mental health and well-being. Then we have Jill Baslow and Mary Burnett, who are going to join us from Cigna to share a little bit about the activities that they've been helping to lead at Cigna. And then finally, Julie Andrews is joining us from HP to talk a little bit about the broader culture initiatives they've had around this area at HP. The students will then rejoin us to recap one of the last pieces of their findings. Throughout this, though, we've got plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. So at any point in time, if you've got a question for the presenters, you can feel free to type that into the chat function, and we'll make sure, I'll make sure to be monitoring that to address questions to the speakers. I'm not sure if we'll have time for live hand-raising type chats because it's being a little chaotic to do both at the same time. So let's plan on using the chat function to push any questions towards me that I can ask the speakers. But again, we want to try and keep this as much of a discussion as possible. So feel free to barrage me with all the questions you might have. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany and Nate to start talking about the research that they've been doing for CAHRS on this topic.
All right, thanks, Chris. And thank you all for joining us. Give me a moment here. I'm going to attempt to share my screen to get the presentation started. So give me 1 second here. Sorry. Is that coming through? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, let's begin. So thanks again for joining us. My name is Nate Miletovich. I'm here with my research partner, Tiffany Jordan, and we're very excited to talk to you today about this all too important topic of promoting mental health and well-being at work and what role managers play in this overall effort. So just a quick rundown of how this is going to go. Chris already mentioned some of this, but I'm going to give a bit of background and context for our research, then turn it over to Tiffany, who will walk us through some of the main findings that we saw. I'll take back over and talk about some of the specific best practices, kick it to our guests for their presentations, very excited about those. And then Tiffany will close out with the challenges and major open questions. So to start, what I wanted to do is to really set the table and just acknowledge that 2020 in more ways than one has been a very challenging year. Just a few of the iconic images that many of us have seen throughout the year in different ways, right? So we're in the middle, still going through a unprecedented global pandemic. We witnessed some horrendous acts of racial injustice this summer and then social unrest. And we also went through a very long and drawn out election. I don't know if any remembers looking for about a week at this electoral college map, as you see here. And it goes without saying that this has been very stressful, right? It's definitely taken its toll on collective well-being. And it certainly has, if you look at the data. So we're going to look at the impact that the events of 2020 have had on collective mental health. So in a few different ways. So We've seen in terms of health outcomes that 2/3 of people have become more stressed during the COVID era compared to before. We've seen 3 times as many people experiencing anxiety or depression compared to any time before. We've also seen these events really impact in ways on our daily lives, right? So 1/3 of people have reported trouble or sleeping or eating due to stress from the pandemic. We've also seen a 12% increase in stress-related substance use. And these events have also brought up some influences on mental health that we've long known about, but perhaps have become more salient, right? So isolation that people have felt during social distancing and the loss of community has certainly had an impact on anxiety and depression, right? And we've also seen financial stress as a result of the economic impacts of the pandemic. We've seen this become a more and more salient factor. So really, no matter how you look at it, it's been a really challenging year. And this notion of mental health, this connection of mental health and work, is something that companies have long known about, right? And many different dimensions. We know about the impact of well-being on job performance. We know that work can be a source of fulfillment and belonging for people. Stress and burnout when work, when things take a turn for worse, these are possible. And we've also seen that the work and family conflict can often pull against one another. This can create stress for the employees involved and also their families, right? But with the events of 2020, what we've seen is that these connections have become really intensified, right? So these connections have become more salient. They've become closer together and more overlapping, right? Work-family conflict takes on a whole new life when you're perpetually working from home, right? And stress and burnout might be facilitated when you also have large kind of global events in the background. So we saw this for this reason, we saw this as a really important thing to focus on for our research, both with some immediate value. So knowing what companies can do to respond in the short run as we navigate, this difficult time, but also it also provides somewhat of an opportunity for companies to look at how do they approach mental health, to what extent can well-being be part of the fabric of their company, be part of the culture of their company, given their industry and their business, right? So it's almost like an opportunity to really take inventory in terms of how companies are going about approaching mental health, So with this in mind, we had 2 main aims in our research. So we wanted to look at this as a matter of programs and initiatives, asking how can companies promote mental health among their employees? And furthermore, we wanted to look at it as a matter of management and leadership practice, right? There's this notion that managers and leaders play a really significant role in the employee experience, right? This is both conventional wisdom and there's research that substantiates this idea. But the extent that this can, that managers can really play a positive role in promoting mental health among their employees is still not quite clear, right? Like we know it's important, but we're not quite clear exactly how this can be practiced, how this can be infused into management philosophy and management principles. So we wanted to look at this layer of this relationship as well. So looking at that, and then in addition to that, if companies are tasking their leaders with this sort of role, how do they support them in this role? How do they prepare them to take on this role? And how do they promote them in their own health and mental health and well-being, right? We often heard this metaphor of being able to put on your own oxygen mask before you help others with theirs, right? So how can you help managers first and foremost be mentally well before they also take on the challenges of their employees? So these were our aims, and I'll talk a little bit more about our process here, our research methods. So we conducted qualitative interviews with 34 HR leaders from 22 different CAHRS partners. So Many thanks to all of those of you who participated. I hope some of you are able to make it today. Really enjoyed these interviews and conversations. So these are primarily qualitative interviews, taking about 45 minutes to an hour, where we focused on these two aims that I just mentioned. From there, we did our analysis. And so we used the affinity diagram method, which is where you look across all of your, pretty much all of our data for main themes, main topics, right? Some of those that were perhaps espoused and talked about consciously, and others that maybe were not so well spoken about. Maybe they were more implicit, right? So we wanted to highlight these themes too, because these are important. Then from there, our analysis has culminated into some major takeaways and strategies, which Tiffany will talk about in a few minutes here, as well as some best practices that we saw companies doing for both of these two aims, right? Promoting mental health from programs and initiatives, and also building this into the practice of management and leadership. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tiffany, and Tiffany, you should be able to take it from here.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Nate. Yep, and it looks like it's working. So we wanted to first start off our presentation today just by taking you maybe through some of the more overarching findings that we were able to pull from that analysis we conducted through those interviews. And I think one of the first things that we noticed in these conversations was that many companies are attempting to address mental health through these pretty large, wide-scaled programs. However, many partners also acknowledge that these kind of one-size-fits-all methods tend to miss some of the unique needs of employee populations. And while there's no doubt that the spectrum of mental health challenges exists even within each of these groups, and there's also the overlap that exists between these groups as well, these 6 groups did emerge in our interviews as those with the most notable needs that required more nuanced approaches. So for manufacturing, for example, their needs are tied to their job function, and that many folks are continuing to physically report to work throughout the pandemic and also have limited access to computers over the course of the workday. So this may limit their ability to take advantage of certain benefits like flexible work arrangements and virtual resources. But I will say by far the employee group that was highlighted in every interview was definitely the caregiver population. So whether it was the expansion of emergency child services, additional flexible work arrangements, or even the inclusion of kind of elderly care benefits through EAPs, this group has probably faced some of the most extreme increases in stress as they juggle the responsibilities associated with child care and elderly care. And companies needed to find ways to respond and support those employees specifically. So there were elements of these strategies that were really tailored to that population. And this will actually be a topic that we'll kind of continue to explore throughout the presentation as well. But as we started to go through our interview data and we tried to kind of make sense of the variety of strategies that we were seeing and kind of happening across organizations, we did start to think about how we could potentially map this onto a formal framework. Our first inclination was to think about mental health strategies as a continuum. So on one end, we may find companies that are kind of in this phase 1 approach where it's still a relatively new topic. And on the other end, we find programs that are very well established and more mature. So as we start to unpack this dimension, we would ask ourselves questions like, is this strategy proactive or does it feel a bit more reactive? Does it sit within the larger compensation and benefits team, or is there a specific health and wellness team that's kind of emerged? Who leads this work and how long have they been in that role? And also, is this initiative kind of organization-wide or is it solely in the United States? So while this was initially helpful, we did start to realize that this model was actually too simplistic. And we started to really unpack some of the rich data that we had and realize that there was a second dimension that emerged. And this one didn't necessarily have to do with longevity. It more so had to do with the integration and scope of the programs themselves. this is where we started to ask questions more like, who's actually creating and driving this program? Is it just the benefits team, or are they also working with diversity inclusion? Are they working with the learning and development teams? Are non-HR leaders involved in this work as well? Also questions around responsibility and accountability. So are people accountable for committing to this strategy? Are these elements incorporated into performance reviews or into promotion models? And are leaders expected to model this behavior openly? It also brought up questions around, are non-HR employees even given opportunities to really invest and kind of serve as ambassadors in this space? And so that's ultimately how we kind of came up with this 4-quadrant framework that you see here today, because neither of these dimensions is more important than the other, and they're not independent of each other either. There's a lot of interaction that's happening here. I also think it's important to note that there's no quadrant that is the right quadrant when it comes to this model, because as I outlined in the last slide, depending on your employee population or even the culture of your organization, what will be most effective for your organization will likely differ than it is for another. So this model is not really meant to be a judgment call. What we do hope it does, however, is help you think about where your organization currently sits, and then to think about where your organization wants to be, and to use these questions to explore some of the changes that may need to happen to your current strategy in order to go into the direction you hope to go in. So at this point, I would like to pause and just check in. I don't know, Chris, if you've seen any questions kind of come through the Q&A box, because we have been talking for quite a bit and want to break before moving on.
Yeah, there's a couple questions that came in through the Q&A. So one, they're just, someone was asking if you guys could give just a little bit more background on who were the participants, who were the folks that you interviewed as part of your research?
Sure, I can take that one. So most of our participants we saw were in some sort of benefits function, right? Some were housed within HR, within benefits. Some companies we noticed actually had devoted teams, whether it was in benefits or outside benefits, to employee well-being or employee experience. This is an interesting structural approach we saw. And then furthermore, some of the folks we talked to were in a division outside of benefits altogether. I remember one, or maybe it was a few different companies we talked to, had a sort of a medical division that focused both on mental and physical health. And then more so, I think we even talked to, once we got into the management and leadership aspects of things, we talked to some HR leaders who were more in learning and development or training and development in some capacity. So I'd say across these different functional areas, this is who we talk to.
Yeah, and the only thing I would maybe add to that piece also is kind of the backgrounds of the folks we talked to is also pretty interesting, in that we saw some people who have lived entire careers in the compensation and benefits space, others who had very formal epidemiology backgrounds who were kind of brought into teams in order to lead this space, and others who even had doctorates and advanced degrees kind of in mental health and counseling specifically, who were also brought in to kind of lead these space. So we saw a lot of expertise on mental health specifically, and those that were chosen to kind of spearhead a lot of these initiatives.
Great. The only other one I have for you, and maybe you could tell me if you want to table this because you're going to touch on it in a bit later in the program. There's been some questions around the idea of involving frontline people managers in this. And there's always the concern of HR pushing more work to frontline people workers. So either now take a little time to talk about what you heard on that, or if you're going to talk about it later, we can table that and come back to it in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think that this was something we heard, and we found there to be no right answer to this challenge, right? In some cases, frontline leaders have really a lot already on their plate, and it was hard to make this a priority, and either it just didn't have room among all the other challenges that were going on with, remote work environments and changing work environments and whatnot. Other cases, yeah, just the nature of the work and the nature of the organization, it wasn't necessarily a priority. So this is something maybe we saw, I'd say, in the manufacturing sector, where you do have frontline leaders who are on the ground working with employees who are often on site, but this is just a challenge in terms of actually bringing this into this employee population. So I'll say that. I don't know, Tiffany, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, and I think to that point, we'll actually be addressing some of those challenges pretty explicitly later on in the presentation. But I agree completely in that the idea of kind of like this trickle down method of how these programs kind of start at the top with the hope that they trickle down. There are many barriers that happen along the way, and specifically for those who are on the front line, because there are some nuanced differences to the way in which they work. And so we will touch a bit more explicitly on those challenges and can maybe unpack that from the perspective of the front line a bit more later on. But great question.
Cool. All right, so I think we can move forward.
I'm going to take back control of the thing here. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to dive now into some of the more specific best practices that we saw companies doing, and we'll do this in a phased approach. So first, I'm going to talk about what we saw as being the foundational practices, right? So practices that were, in a sense, necessary to do during this difficult time, right? And really practices to start with. And I'll break it apart by, again, by programs and initiatives that we saw, as well as practices when it came to management and leadership. And I'm just going to give a couple examples here. This is something where we'll go into more detail in the report that will be forthcoming, but just to keep it simple and focused today, we'll just give a few examples, and then also if you have specific questions that I can expand on these a little bit more in our Q&A. But one thing that we saw pretty much every company doing was an expansion of the EAP offerings and the implementation of telehealth in some way. So with EAP, this might mean doubling the number of counseling sessions that were available to employees from 5 to 10 or from 10 to 20, right? We also saw implementation of telehealth. So we saw some companies who even had on-site mental health counselors, and if those sites closed down, maybe they weren't able to do that anymore. So they quickly moved to some sort of telehealth platform. We saw this as a necessity to, continue to make these resources available. We also saw for companies who perhaps had EAP vendors with external mental health resources, we saw them quickly also find some way to implement telehealth. So as if perhaps someone was, previously going to a therapist out in the world, they were able to do so by telehealth. So furthermore, from there we saw often through EAP vendors the offering of webinars on resiliency, mindfulness, and self-care. In many cases, these were offered by the EAP vendors themselves. In some cases, they were self-organized by employees. We saw this as a crucial thing to offer. Furthermore, we saw different arrangements for flexible work, right? This was especially crucial for the caregiver population, like Tiffany mentioned, right? We also saw some companies offer the idea of a mental health day or some sort of vacation day for wellness if employees needed it, right? So we saw this as also a crucial thing. Moving on to management and leadership. So one thing we saw almost all companies doing was in regular meetings with managers or leaders, they would have some sort of spotlight on mental health as a major issue. So for example, in October, when we had World Mental Health Day, almost every company had done this in some way, right? We also saw it in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and protests at the end of May and then into June. We saw companies bring this up too as a major consideration for managers themselves and their employees, right? So really elevating mental health and well-being as issues that leaders and managers need to have in mind. I'll just list the rest here, and again, we'll go over these more in detail in our report, but COVID task forces, which HR was often a part of, where there was a focus on well-being, we saw this as necessary. And then also newsletters and ways to promote resources, often targeted at managers themselves to then get out the word to their employees. We also saw these as really important too. So next, we saw these, again, we saw these as like kind of the first step, and essential measures to take. I want to talk a little bit about some of the really innovative and exciting things that we saw companies doing. So once you had done those things, you could also try doing some of these new things. And again, by programs and initiatives and management and leadership. So firstly, one really cool program we saw a lot of companies doing was mental health first aid. And so this is where they had employees trained in doing really basic mental health support and triage for their colleagues who may be going through some sort of distress or mental health episode. It's not necessarily diagnosis and it's not necessarily therapy. Many companies were very clear to be able to draw the bright line between mental health first aid and actual therapy. It's an important distinction to make. But we saw this as a really cool program. In various stages, some companies had actually had like kind of fully functioning programs. Others were still piloting this in different parts of the company. And we saw this as having some really cool benefits. One is that it can really meet people where they are at, right? Someone might be more willing to go and talk with a fellow colleague about their challenges, as opposed to someone who is in HR that maybe they don't know that well, they don't maybe feel comfortable talking with them about this personal challenge, or if they've never gone through therapy, maybe they don't even feel comfortable yet reaching out to find a therapist. So if you can sort of normalize this and bring it to someone who's a fellow colleague, this can be a way of really meeting people where they're at. We saw this to be a really cool idea. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh yeah, and this went by many different names. I think that it just kind of depended on the culture of the organization. Some would call it mental health first aid. Others would call it allyship or mental health allies. I think it really depends on, what is in the lexicon, what is in the language of your company. But nonetheless, a very, very important program. Just running through these last few, we also saw partnership with different employee resource groups. Many of those that we saw that Tiffany mentioned, caregivers, people of color, right? Having offerings that are tailored to reflect the different needs of these different employee populations. HR teams, like we mentioned, the structural approach, the different structural approach, right? Devoting HR leaders to actual employee well-being or experience, right? This is a really cool idea. And then even some outside the box ideas, converting gyms to childcare centers. I remember hearing this, or implementing company-wide shutdowns, right? If maybe people aren't taking their vacation days, what better to do than find ways to get everyone to take a break, right? This really is, again, a way of normalizing self-care and well-being. Moving on to management and leadership practice, right? So we saw the spotlight on mental health as an issue. And now to really bring it home, we saw some companies doing this, which we thought was really cool, where they would actually spotlight on leaders, senior leaders at the company who had had mental health challenges. This again is a way of normalizing mental health as an issue that anyone goes through and anyone can get help with, right? It's really a way of role modeling with your senior leaders that this is something that is part of life, right? And it's okay, and we have resources for you here. So this is really going a step beyond. And then just to run down these few others, really conceiving leaders as people leaders, right? Seeing this as an important dimension of leadership and really calling this out. Having trainings and protocols for these difficult conversations that managers may have to have if employees are struggling with mental health challenges, actually providing them with resources. And then finally, a really cool novel idea is actually having a dimension around mental health and well-being is really worked into employee experience that is then incorporated into performance reviews for managers. Very cutting edge, very cool. And this is something that we'll expand on more in our report. So I think that's everything. And now, having gone through the framework for strategies, the different approaches that companies can take, and then some of the specific practices they can actually implement, we're going to look at, we're going to turn it over to our guests who are now, we're very happy to have them, and we thought they had great approaches, and we're very happy to have them here to speak with you about what they're doing for their companies.
Great. Just before we bring Jill and Mary from Cigna on, just one question for the students. So this question around how to get managers, frontline people managers prepared. Some of these are some pretty difficult conversations in a space that's probably pretty uncomfortable for most line leaders. Anything you heard in terms of either consistent practices or innovative practices to help these leaders be more prepared, be more comfortable, be more efficacious in having these kinds of conversations with their direct reports?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me is it's kind of like a twofold approach that needs to happen. On one end, I mean, as Nate mentioned, it's really important to make the distinction between asking leaders to start these conversations and have them versus asking them to become counselors. And I think that distinction does need to be pretty explicit and clear. But I think some of the ways that we saw with partners, the way they started to do that was one, just thinking about competencies that these leaders would need to have in order to do that work. So that could be trainings around not just resilience, but also trainings around active listening, about what it means to be an empathetic leader, about giving them actual tangible agency with their teams to also be able to give flexible work arrangements if they see that employees on their team are struggling. On the other end, there's kind of like a communications need that also emerges. And I think a lot of companies did a great job of describing how they created these almost handbooks for leaders. And it wasn't a handbook in the sense of, you know, if X happens, you should do Y, but was providing very explicit language of if an employee sends you an email asking about this or asked to talk about this, we're not expecting you to come up with this language yourself. We're like, to the T telling you how you should be responding to these employees or to these requests, or when to know that this is not something that you should need to field and that this is something that you can kind of put off to HR and your HR business partners that you have in that space. So I do think it's not really, I wouldn't describe it as hand holding, but I think it's just acknowledging that there's a lot of pressure on leaders at this point to both continue to meet business needs as well as kind of taking on these additional responsibilities. So really finding ways to kind of ease that process for them and kind of make it a streamlined process if you can.
Great. Just a couple more questions. So, I think we've spent a lot of time in this space over the years in CAHRS in the general employee health and well-being space. And we know that for every program that companies create, it's difficult to communicate these programs in ways that people can readily learn about it, understand what the benefits are, understand if it's available for them. So what did you guys learn in the communication space around across these disparate populations? Are there tricks, strategies of how to effectively communicate the availability of these programs, how to access them, things like that?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Tiffany, you can add. This is I think one of the still open questions and big challenges, this communication piece. And yeah, we kind of saw this wide range where there like was perhaps like really no means of communication in place, and others where there were means of communication in place, but there were so many offerings, it was sort of hard to kind of highlight the ones that might be best for someone. So I think this is still a pretty an open question and a tough area. I think it really varied. So I don't know if I have any like really major insights in this regard. I don't know, Tiffany, if you can remember anything, or maybe this is something we can talk about more in our challenges section as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely something we'll talk about a bit more in that challenges section, but I think some of the notable things that I can recall from the interviews was just kind of thinking you have to be a bit more creative and maybe go back to some like old school approaches when it comes to especially the front line and in those manufacturing spaces where they're just simply not sitting in front of a computer during the day. And so an internal website is not really going to be helpful. You're now asking them to kind of engage in that space on their personal time as opposed to during the workday. And so a couple companies that had very large manufacturing populations talked about just using paper and like disseminating information that way during the workday in break rooms. They also talked about having resources there or screens there that kind of provided quick links for those that had big customer service populations who were kind of out on the road doing service. They do have technology, but it's usually more in the sense of like an iPad or a phone. So thinking about ways to simplify language and communication so that way it's digestible even in those formats. So I think it's kind of trying to meet them where they are and not try to kind of like enforce the way that's easiest for the most scaled approach, and to really think about how you can help them to get that information, because you can't necessarily depend on some of those virtual resources.
Great. All right, last one before we move on to Jill and Mary. So there was a question around the mental health first aid. So if he gives just a little bit more detail on, how companies might roll that out, what does it look like, and how does it maybe differ from other programs?
Sure, I'll say a little bit more about that. I think in most cases, we saw it implemented with the help of some sort of outside provider, right? Either through the current EAP vendor or through some other, someone else who had expertise in this area. I don't think it was ever kind of organized by the company itself, but it was often brought in with outside expertise. And I think most companies were doing it just as a pretty brief training, or not brief itself, but not an exhaustive training. I think maybe 8 hours of training or what have you, and maybe different scenarios that they would walk through, talking points, and then always making sure that they were clear on what sort of resources they could connect the employee to, right? Like it's really, it really is kind of meant to be, an initial act of just listening to somebody, empathizing with them, and understanding that they're going through a challenge, right? But then also, the person providing the mental health first aid, knowing that, like they're not supposed to really make this an ongoing counseling relationship, and that really the objective of this situation is to make a referral to someone to get to those resources. So I think that's kind of that's the idea in a nutshell. I think, with the remote work situation, I think that companies probably had different ways of doing this. I don't know if they were doing it with a hotline or, also by Zoom, or having different sort of logistical means of connecting folks, but usually support from an outside provider, usually a training with these different elements, and then various logistical approaches. So I hope that covers it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So if you guys want to, great, already read my mind. Okay, so next up, we're going to move into a little bit what Julie was talking about and Jill mentioned in terms of, how do we keep this sustainable? I think it also matches up with everything we know about HR activities as well, right? As we try and drive HR change, just how do we make this stick and become part of our culture and the way we do things? So I'll turn it back to Tiffany and Nate.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I will share my screen and then turn it over to Tiffany. So give me 1 second here. Okay. And
Okay, great. Thank you, Nate. So thank you to both of our presenters. As you can see, we've kind of heard a lot and talked a lot today about how to build these kind of strong and effective mental health strategies. And we wanted to just close by diving a bit more into something we alluded to earlier, the reality of the challenges that are still kind of faced when approaching this kind of work. So on this slide, you'll see 5 different challenges kind of depicted as these pillars that are supporting a structure that you can think of as like your mental health strategy. These were areas that were most cited throughout our interviews, and all 5 need to be addressed in order to have a program that's not only effective and impactful, but also sustainable. We're in this kind of for the long haul, and I see that Professor Dyer, you also asked a very similar question in the Q&A box of how can we just ensure that we're not just doing all this great work in this moment and can really think about how this phases out for the years to come. So while these are depicted here as challenges, I also think it's interesting to think of them as areas of opportunity as well. And we can start off by talking about this ownership and management component. So underneath this bucket, we're really thinking about how can the work in mental health still continue to be innovated by HR teams, but perhaps operated by other areas of the business to kind of give more room for innovation and different phases of these programs to continue. It definitely makes sense to us that a lot of the development of the content is being driven by these teams, since that's where the expertise lies. But should they be the only teams responsible for disseminating it? I think that's the big question. So I think we've heard from our guest speakers today that there's a lot of value in leaning on talent management, talent acquisition, learning and development, diversity, inclusion, as well as leaders in non-HR spaces, since it does really touch all of us, to think about how to operationalize a lot of the work and initiatives that are being spearheaded in this space. And that allows for these programs to kind of continue and to keep iterating and changing. The second piece here is around measurement and reporting. And I think this is often a challenge in all facets and topics of HR that we talk about, but it really is just trying to figure out how do you even know which benefits that you're introducing are the most helpful. And I think the unintentional and kind of underlying question here is also, what does this mean for the future of rewards? How are you thinking about your return on investment? How are you ensuring that there's a transfer of knowledge happening between all these great resources that are being introduced in a training environment to what's actually happening on in a day-to-day. I think it can also mean kind of defining some of the competencies or skills, if you prefer to call them that you want to begin to highlight in performance conversations between leaders and their teams as a way to ensure that this is kind of deeply entrenched in your company and will persist even after the pandemic ends. The third bucket here is something that's come up a lot in our Q&A today and even in the presentations as well, around communications. And it really is, how do you kind of hit all your populations, especially and particularly your frontline employees and those in kind of those service and manufacturing positions. I think benefits can be kind of a double-edged sword. That's how a lot of companies highlighted it when they talked about it, of you don't want to offer too little and not hit the needs of your employees, but by offering so much, it can make it really difficult for employees to even know where to find resources or how to find the specific things they need. So I think it's important to think about ways to make channels direct, but to also make them customizable. And that in some ways kind of reminds me of what Cigna spoke of with their intranet site, of kind of allowing employees to kind of go into the central location and answer and pick options that kind of answer the questions and needs that they have in those moments. I also think in this space around communications, again, thinking about this ownership and management, it's sometimes helpful to think about ways to partner with your communications and your IT teams as well, since they do have the expertise on how to communicate to customers. They can similarly think about the best ways to communicate all these resources to your employees and thinking about them almost as a customer themselves. This fourth piece on leadership asks us to, it really ties, I think, most directly to our research questions that we had in the beginning around what does this mean for the manager population? So thinking about how emotional intelligence may become a competency that you want to include in your definition of what people leadership really means. Asking how leaders can navigate that line between being a manager and kind of an expert in some of those offerings without becoming a counselor, and thinking about what resources you provide and how you're updating those resources as circumstances change. I also think thinking about just the evaluation and rewards programs that you have around leaders and managers, and thinking, is this going to be incorporated in, end of year rewards? Will it impact who you identify as kind of high potential employees, or highlight new pathways to leadership within your company? So kind of thinking about how, as these skills emerge as important, how you will truly incorporate it throughout the organization. And I think most importantly, again, for that leader population, really asking how you're supporting your managers with their own mental health and well-being concerns as they're kind of navigating these very new and challenging waters. The last piece here is something that I talked about in the beginning, and it's going to kind of close us out for today. And it really is around the disparate impact and diverse populations that exist within every organization, and just asking how you're meeting the unique needs of these groups. I think especially for people of color, for caregivers, this can become especially important. And I loved that program that HP highlighted of talking about having a very specific, session just for Black employees with a licensed therapist, right? So thinking about ways to really tailor and meet the needs of those employees. I think also it's interesting to think about early in career employees who are, tend to be younger on the age spectrum. They may be more subject to isolation since they're not in the workplace, and they're also not getting the same opportunities for networking and connection that they used to. Similarly, employees who have pre-existing conditions, whether that's physical health or mental health, you may find that they are also particularly struggling at this time, especially since this has lasted, I think, a lot longer than many of us thought it was going to. So really wanting to think about, vignetting almost your employee populations and creating those storyboards to really think if the offerings you have are truly meeting the needs of all those nuances. And I think long-term, also thinking about some of the downstream effects this may have on these employee groups. I know particularly around women in the workplace who are dropping out of the workforce at much higher rates than any other group. This may end up having impacts on pay equity and promotion equity as people are kind of off-ramping and then coming back. For young employees, it may also have some questions around retention, or for people of color as well. So wanting to start anticipating some of those potential downstream effects and thinking about ways that you can solution that at this moment before you kind of hit that hurdle down the long run. And then lastly, in this kind of diverse population bucket, also just thinking about your international populations, because due to significant differences in government as well as policy and culture, it's likely very challenging to have just one kind of universal message that your company's pushing. But that does not mean that those employees don't also deserve the support that is culturally competent to wherever they happen to be geographically located. So again, thinking sustainably how you can kind of highlight that altogether. So I think in many ways, these challenges aren't new. Many of them were highlighted in the questions today, and it's because they really are meaty and they're kind of critical to any successful HR strategy. So this isn't, again, meant to be any kind of judgment call for companies, but just another framework that we think can be utilized, especially if you feel like your company is actually where you want it to be. And now you're starting to think about how can we make sure this persists and is as successful in the long term. So in conclusion, we just wanted to kind of wrap up with our two main takeaways from all the wonderful conversations that we have, and just kind of saying that organizations can really examine their mental health and well-being strategies by first using that 4 kind of quadrant framework that we introduce, and thinking in this integrated versus siloed, and then the nascent versus established dimensions. Where does your company lie? Where do you want to be? And what questions can you begin to ask to get there? And then second, in order to develop that strategy that's not just impactful, but also sustainable and can persist, start thinking about those challenge areas, each of those pillars, and seeing if you can be a bit more creative and kind of approaching how you might solution some of those challenges for the future. So we wanted to just give a big thank you to all of the companies who participated in our research. These conversations, I think, were instrumental to both Nate and I. It taught us a lot, and we appreciated the amount of transparency that you all had and the time you took to dedicate to us. And it's great to hear kind of firsthand about the amazing work that's been happening in this space. And we're excited to see kind of how it will continue. So with that, we wanted to say thank you and kind of offer our last opportunity for questions and answers before wrapping up today's session.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, Nate. I also want to thank Jill and Mary and Julie for presenting. I don't see any new questions coming in. I will tell the folks who are still with us, the students are working on the physical report to go with this. So there'll be more details behind what they presented. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us. In the spirit of mental health and well-being, I also want to give the last 15 minutes back to folks to do their own personal recharge before they have to move on to whatever meeting comes next. So again, special thanks to all the speakers today and for all the companies that participated in the CAHRS research that went into the students' report. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all at a future CAHRS event. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.